Welcome back to the channel where we discover that ancient history always finds a way to be even more depressing than you imagined. Today we're exploring the story of Medusa, not the Hollywood version with spectacular special effects, but the original Greek version where a devoted and innocent young woman transforms into antiquity's most feared monster for having the audacity to be too beautiful and be in the wrong place at the wrong time. It's basically a story about how Greek gods had less emotional maturity than reality show participants, and how a rape victim was transformed into the villain of her own story. Before we dive into this tragedy that would make Shakespeare seem optimistic, I need you to do that usual thing. Subscribe to the channel, leave your like, and in the comments tell me what time it is where you are and where you're listening from. I love knowing there are people discovering that being a priestess in ancient Greece was an even worse idea than working customer service during Black Friday. Now then, imagine yourself relaxing as we explore why you definitely wouldn't have survived being Medusa. Not the mythological creature with snake hair that everyone knows, but the young woman she was before becoming every Greek warrior's nightmare. Tonight, we'll discover how a devout and well-intentioned girl transformed into antiquity's most feared monster, thanks mainly to the whims of gods who had the emotional maturity of spoiled teenagers. Take a deep breath and let yourself be transported to a world where being too beautiful was literally a capital crime, where gods resolved their personal differences by ruining innocent mortals' lives, and where rape victims were blamed for their own rapes. A world that, thinking about it, wasn't so different from certain aspects of our society. But at least nowadays we don't have to worry about snakes growing in our hair when someone blames us for crimes we didn't commit. Imagine waking before dawn in a modest stone house near the Greek coast, where the sound of waves mingles with the songs of fishermen already departing for another day of work. You are Medusa, still a common mortal young woman, daughter of minor sea deities who, frankly, weren't exactly what you'd call parents of the year. Phorcys and Ceto, your progenitors, were the type of deities who generated strange creatures as a hobby. Your sisters Athena and Euryale already showed disturbing signs of their future Gorgon nature since childhood. But you were born different. Completely human in appearance, with dark hair that shone under Mediterranean sunlight like liquid silk. It was the type of beauty that made people stop in the street, which, in retrospect, should have been a giant red warning sign flashing, "Trouble ahead." Your morning routine began with a walk to the nearest freshwater spring, carrying a clay jug that your still inexperienced hands sometimes let slip. The path wound between ancient olive trees and lavender bushes, filling the air with aromas that today we'd consider worthy of expensive spa candles. But for you, it was just the smell of home. At the spring, you met other young women from the region, daughters of fishermen, farmers, small merchants. They talked about arranged marriages, about which boys were handsomest, about the latest gossip from the nearby city. You listened politely, but your mind was always elsewhere. While they dreamed of husbands and children, you dreamed of something much more dangerous: serving the goddess Athena. It was an obsession that began when you were small and your friend Iphicles played at being heroes with you. He always insisted on being some famous warrior, while you inevitably chose to represent Athena, the goddess of wisdom, just war, strategy. There was something about the idea of a female divinity who didn't need a husband, who was respected for her intelligence and strength, that resonated deeply in your young soul. After fetching water, you returned home to help with domestic tasks. Your mother Ceto, when not busy generating bizarre sea creatures, tried to teach you the basic skills of a young Greek woman: weaving, cooking, managing a household. You learned everything diligently, but your heart wasn't really there. Your hands worked at the loom, but your mind recited prayers to Athena that you'd memorized from hearing other devotees. Meals at your house were interesting. Imagine sitting at the table with parents who occasionally made casual comments about, "That time we created a sea monster," or "Remember when your brother was born with tentacles?" For a family of minor sea deities, you lived surprisingly modestly, mainly fresh fish, olives, barley bread, and goat cheese when there was extra money. Your father Forces had the disturbing habit of testing his daughters to see which developed interesting characteristics. That is, monstrous ones. He was genuinely disappointed with you for remaining so normal. "Where are your scales?" he would ask occasionally. "Your fangs? Your compound eyes?" As if common human beauty were some kind of shameful genetic defect. You spent afternoons frequently on the beach with Iphicles, your best friend since childhood. He was the only one who truly understood your obsession with Athena, though sometimes you noticed he looked at you in a way that suggested his feelings were evolving beyond friendship. You collected shells, built small temples in the sand for the goddess, and debated stories about famous heroes. "Someday I'm going to be a priestess of Athena," you declared with the absolute conviction only teenagers can have. "I'll live in the great temple in Athens and dedicate my life to wisdom." Iphicles smiled, but there was a sadness in his eyes that you were too young to fully understand. "What if Athena doesn't accept you?" he asked gently. "She will accept me," you responded with total confidence. "I'm sure of it." It was the kind of innocent certainty that the universe seems to enjoy destroying in increasingly creative ways. Your nights were spent under stars that seemed incredibly close, without the light pollution that obscures modern skies. You lay on sand still warm from the day, contemplating constellations you'd known since childhood, whispering prayers to Athena and planning your escape to a life of religious devotion. What you didn't know, because no one ever told you, was that being a beautiful young woman in ancient Greece was like carrying a target on your back. Especially when your life plan involved chastity, devotion, and attracting attention from notoriously jealous and possessive gods. You were basically applying to become an example of how Greek fate loved cruel ironies. But in those early days, you still believed that purity of intention and sincere devotion would be enough to protect you. You still thought gods were just that they rewarded virtue, and that a dedicated young woman would be respected and protected. It was a beautiful innocence, completely doomed to failure. Now that you've experienced the relatively normal childhood of Medusa, if we can call growing up in a family where your sisters developed fangs and your parents were disappointed you weren't mutating into a sea creature normal, it's time to follow the decision that would change everything: her departure for Athens to become a priestess. Let your breathing calm as we explore how a young woman full of dreams and religious devotion managed to get herself into the biggest mess in Greek mythology simply by wanting to faithfully serve a goddess. It was like applying for your dream job only to discover your boss is a narcissistic psychopath with control issues. Except in this case, the boss was literally an immortal goddess with the power to transform people into monsters. Medusa's decision to leave for Athens wasn't taken lightly. In fact, she spent months preparing, studying rituals, memorizing hymns, and practicing the perfect posture for carrying offerings without spilling anything. It was the kind of obsessive preparation we'd recognize today as signs of either an extremely dedicated person or someone with severe performance anxiety. Iphicles, her best friend and secret admirer, tried until the last moment to dissuade her. "Medusa," he said, with the desperate wisdom of someone about to lose the person they love, "have you considered that maybe Athena doesn't need another priestess? How about staying here and, I don't know, opening a school for children? You're good at teaching." But Medusa was determined with the characteristic stubbornness of someone who'd never had their dreams truly tested by reality. "Iphicles," she replied with the patience of someone explaining something obvious, "my destiny is to serve the goddess of wisdom. I can't waste my life with normalcy." The irony, of course, is that this normalcy she rejected included things like not having snakes for hair, not turning people to stone with a glance, and generally continuing to live as a human being. But at 18, no one really appreciates the value of being tediously normal. The journey to Athens was an adventure in itself. Imagine traveling over 100 kilometers on foot and by cart, carrying only a small bag with your most precious possessions. Some simple clothes, a handful of coins her parents managed to scrape together, and a small Athena amulet she'd carved from olive wood. It was like moving cities today, but without a moving truck, GPS, or the guarantee you wouldn't be attacked by bandits, wild animals, or capricious gods along the way. When she finally glimpsed Athens for the first time, Medusa was genuinely breathless. The city was everything she'd imagined and more. The Acropolis rising majestically over the urban landscape, the Parthenon still under construction but already imposing, streets bustling with philosophers, merchants, artists, and pilgrims from all over the known world. It was the ancient equivalent of arriving in New York for the first time. Intimidating, exciting, and slightly overwhelming. The Temple of Athena in the Parthenon was even more impressive than she'd dreamed. Marble columns rose like stone trees, and the statue of the goddess, made of gold and ivory, seemed to watch every movement with eyes that shone almost as if they were alive. Medusa knelt before the statue and made a silent prayer that can be summarized as, "Please accept me. I promise to be the best priestess you've ever had." The selection process to become a priestess was rigorous in a way that would make modern job interviews seem like casual conversations. There were tests of religious knowledge, demonstrations of moral purity, assessments of dedication, and, more crucially, physical inspections to ensure candidates were suitable to serve the goddess. Medusa passed all with distinction, which should have been a victory, but was actually the beginning of her problems. You see, when the physical suitability test included a beauty assessment, because apparently Athena wanted her priestesses to reflect her own divine perfection, Medusa didn't just pass, she practically broke the scoring system. Her dark, wavy hair, her flawless skin, her expressive eyes, everything conspired to create the kind of beauty that made people stop in the street and whisper comments. And here's where the situation started getting complicated in a specifically Greek way. Medusa's exceptional beauty began attracting more attention than the goddess herself. Pilgrims came to the temple not just to honor Athena, but to catch a glimpse of the extraordinarily beautiful priestess who conducted the rituals. It was like a store employee becoming more famous than the brand. Technically a positive thing, but destined to cause problems with management. The vows Medusa made upon becoming an official priestess were solemn and binding. Perpetual chastity, exclusive devotion to Athena, total obedience to the goddess's precepts, and maintenance of temple purity. She recited each word with absolute conviction, genuinely believing she'd be able to fulfill everything perfectly. It was the kind of youthful optimism that makes you assume lifelong commitments without really considering all the variables involved. Daily life as a priestess was structured and demanding. Medusa woke before dawn to light the sacred lamps, prepared offerings, conducted morning rituals, received pilgrims, kept the temple clean, studied sacred texts, and coordinated religious festivals. It was a full-time job that required not just devotion, but also considerable administrative skills. No one ever mentions that being a priestess in ancient Greece was basically being manager of a busy religious center. Iphicles, who had gotten work as an artisan in Athens specifically to stay near her, appeared regularly to check how she was adapting. It was sweet and slightly pathetic. He clearly hoped she'd change her mind about this whole priestess thing and decide she preferred a normal life with him. Medusa appreciated his friendship, but was completely absorbed in her new life of religious devotion. What she didn't realize was that her growing fame as the most beautiful priestess in Athens was beginning to annoy her own goddess. Athena, being a deity with controlling tendencies and serious ego issues, wasn't particularly enthusiastic about being upstaged by a mortal, even if that mortal was her own dedicated priestess. Meanwhile, from the other side of the divine pantheon, Poseidon, god of the seas and Zeus's brother, was watching this whole situation unfold with the interest of someone who sees an opportunity to cause trouble. His rivalry with Athena dated back to the founding of Athens itself, when citizens chose her gift, an olive tree, over a saltwater spring. It was the kind of divine grudge that fermented for centuries, waiting for the perfect opportunity for revenge. And Athena's extraordinarily beautiful and devoted priestess was about to become that perfect opportunity, in a way she could never have predicted. Medusa continued her daily duties, believing her life was finally following the right path, unaware she was being watched by divine eyes that saw her not as a faithful servant, but as a piece in a cosmic chess game where she didn't even know she was playing. Now we reach the part of the story that transformed a devoted young woman into Greek mythology's most feared creature. Prepare yourself to discover how a single act of divine violence destroyed not just one life, but the entire notion of justice in the ancient world. This is the story of how Medusa became a victim twice. First of rape, then of a system that blamed victims so systematically we still find echoes of it in modern society. Let your mind relax as we explore one of the most disturbing episodes in Greek mythology, not because of the violence itself, but because of the completely disproportionate and unjust reaction that followed. It was as if the universe had decided one person hadn't suffered enough and needed to suffer even more, just to make sure the lesson, whatever it was crystal clear. Medusa had spent months faithfully serving in Athena's temple, conducting rituals with the precision of a Swiss watchmaker and the devotion of someone who genuinely believed she was fulfilling her divine purpose. Her routine was impeccable. Wake before dawn, light the sacred lamps, prepare offerings, receive pilgrims, keep the temple immaculate. She was the model employee of a religious organization. Except her boss was a notoriously temperamental goddess with serious jealousy issues. The problem was that Medusa had become too famous. Pilgrims came from all over Greece not just to honor Athena, but to see in person the most beautiful priestess in Athens. It was like being a religious influencer before social media existed. Technically she was doing her job perfectly, but was inadvertently overshadowing the main brand. On that fateful afternoon, Medusa left the temple to collect flowers and medicinal herbs necessary for a special ritual. It was a routine task she'd done dozens of times, walking to the nearby coast where the most suitable plants for sacred offerings grew. What she didn't know was that she was being watched by someone who had decided to use her as an instrument of personal revenge. Poseidon emerged from the sea with all the terrifying majesty of a god of the oceans. Imagine a man of imposing stature, beard dark as a storm, eyes reflecting the depth of ocean abysses, and a presence that made the surrounding air vibrate with divine power. For a young mortal, it was simultaneously magnificent and absolutely terrifying, like meeting a celebrity you'd always admired, but discovering they're a psychopath. "So you're the famous priestess," he said, with the tone of someone evaluating merchandise. "I can see why my niece is so concerned about the attention you receive." Medusa, polite as she'd been raised, made a respectful bow. "My lord Poseidon," she said, keeping her eyes lowered as protocol required when mortals addressed deities. "How may I serve you?" The question was purely formal, the kind of courtesy you learn when working in customer service. She wasn't literally offering to serve him, she was just being polite. But Poseidon, like many powerful men throughout history, heard what he wanted to hear. "Interesting that you offer your services," he replied, taking a step toward her. "I have a proposal. Abandon your foolish vows to my niece and come with me. I can offer much more than a life of celibacy serving a goddess who doesn't even properly appreciate your beauty." It was basically the divine equivalent of a rich, powerful man offering to be a young employee's mentor. Medusa, who was not only devout but also not an idiot, immediately realized where this was going. "Thank you for the offer, my lord," she responded with the diplomacy of someone who works customer service and needs to reject inappropriate proposals without offending important clients. "But I've made sacred vows to Athena. I cannot break my commitment." What happened next was a perfect example of how absolute power corrupts absolutely. Poseidon, accustomed to having everything he wanted when he wanted it, didn't react well to rejection. His expression hardened with the indignation of someone who had never heard "no" as an answer. "Vows," he spat, as if the word were a personal insult. "You'd rather waste your youth serving an eternal virgin than experience the pleasures a god can offer?" Medusa tried to back away, but she was on an isolated beach with a god of the oceans who literally controlled all aquatic escape routes. "Please, my lord," she said, her voice beginning to tremble, "respect my vows." "Athena." "Athena," Poseidon interrupted with disdain, "can watch." What followed was one of the most cowardly acts in Greek mythology. And considering we're talking about a pantheon where Zeus transformed into animals to rape women, that's saying a lot. Poseidon attacked Medusa right there on the beach, ignoring her screams, her tears, her desperate pleas for mercy. Iphicles, who had followed Medusa at a respectful distance out of concern for her safety, tried to intervene. Imagine a 20-year-old mortal young man trying to confront a primordial god of the oceans armed only with a fisherman's knife and desperate courage. It was like trying to stop a hurricane with an umbrella, but he tried anyway. Poseidon brushed him aside with a casual blow that hurled him against the rocks, leaving him unconscious and seriously injured. To the god, Iphicles was just a minor inconvenience, a fly to be swatted while he continued his attack. Medusa, realizing there was no escape, did the only thing left to her. She ran to the only place she considered safe, Athena's temple. If there was anywhere in the world where a priestess should be protected from violence, it would be at her own goddess's altar, right? Wrong. Terribly, tragically wrong. Poseidon followed her to the temple and completed his attack on Athena's own sacred altar. It was a deliberate and calculated desecration. He wasn't just attacking Medusa, he was humiliating his niece by violating her most sacred place. It was like vandalizing someone's house after attacking a family member, a layered violation designed to cause maximum possible pain. When he finished, Poseidon withdrew with the satisfaction of someone who had executed perfectly planned revenge. He had humiliated Athena, destroyed her most devoted priestess, and desecrated her most sacred temple, all at once. For him, it was a masterpiece of divine retaliation. For Medusa, it was simply the end of the world as she knew it. She remained on the temple's cold floor, traumatized, violated, and completely broken. Iphicles arrived shortly after, still bleeding from his head, and tried to comfort her, but she was beyond consolation. What came next was the most disturbing part of the entire story. Not the rape itself, but the reaction of the goddess who should have protected her faithful priestess. When Athena discovered what had happened in her temple, and let's be honest, she was probably watching the whole time, her reaction wasn't compassion for the victim or anger at the aggressor. Her reaction was to blame Medusa. "You brought this upon yourself," declared the goddess, her voice echoing through the marble columns with the authority of someone who had never had to question their own decisions. "Your excessive beauty attracted undue attention. You seduced my uncle and defiled my temple." It was victim blaming in its purest and most ancient form, blaming the rape victim for provoking the attack through her appearance or behavior. The fact that Medusa had explicitly rejected Poseidon's advances, that she had tried to flee, that she had begged for protection, all of this was conveniently ignored. The transformation that followed was both punishment and an attempt to eliminate evidence. Athena transformed Medusa's beautiful hair into venomous serpents and her eyes into weapons that petrified anyone who looked directly at them. It was as if the goddess were saying, "If your beauty caused this problem, I'll make sure you're never beautiful again." The first test of this new power was tragic and ironic. Iphicles, still dazed and bleeding, tried to approach to comfort Medusa. When she screamed for him to stay away, already sensing something terrible had happened to her, he didn't listen. One of the serpents in her hair bit him, and when their gazes met, the young man who had loved her since childhood turned to stone. Medusa was left alone in the temple, contemplating the statue of her best friend, realizing her life had ended in a way she could never have imagined. She had entered the temple as a devoted priestess and victim of violence. She left as a monster who could no longer have human contact without causing death. The story would later spread as the legend of the terrible Gorgon who turned men to stone with a glance. But few would remember that behind the monster was a young woman who only wanted to serve her goddess and live a life of purpose and devotion. Now that we've followed the most unjust transformation in Greek mythology, it's time to explore something even more depressing. How Medusa went from traumatized victim to terrifying legend, living decades in complete isolation while the world transformed her into every ambitious hero's nightmare. Prepare to discover that being a mythological monster was basically like living in perpetual quarantine, but without Netflix, food delivery, or the hope that someday everything would return to normal. Let your breathing calm as we explore how a young woman who only wanted to serve her goddess ended up spending the rest of her life hiding in a cave, avoiding human contact to prevent accidentally transforming innocent visitors into garden decoration. It was like being a carrier of a deadly contagious disease, except that the disease was literally killing people just by looking at them. After involuntarily transforming Iphicles into a statue in Athena's temple, Medusa went into total panic. Imagine discovering you developed a superpower that only serves to cause tragedies, like having X-ray vision, but that kills anyone you look at directly. Not exactly the kind of special ability you'd want to have. Her first reaction was to try to reverse what had happened. She spent hours touching Iphicles' statue, pleading, crying, trying anything that might bring him back. It was the kind of desperate denial anyone goes through when facing traumatic loss, except in this case the loss had been caused by her own eyes. When other priests arrived at the temple the next morning and found Medusa lamenting over a strangely realistic statue of a young man, the situation escalated quickly. One of the older priests looked directly at her before she could warn about the danger, and instantly joined the temple's involuntary art collection. From there, news spread through the city with the typical speed of gossip in small communities. Athena's priestess has transformed into a monster. She kills with a glance. Snakes grew in her hair. It was like going viral on social media, but in the ancient Greek version where viral literally meant everyone wants to kill you. Medusa quickly realized she couldn't stay in Athens. Every person she accidentally encountered turned to stone, and soon there would be an entire collection of statues marking her path through the city. It was like leaving a trail of destruction, but a very artistic and permanent trail. She fled during the night, wrapping her head in thick veils and keeping her eyes firmly fixed on the ground. Imagine trying to navigate the world looking only at your own feet. It's difficult enough when you're just trying to avoid uncomfortable eye contact, let alone when eye contact means instant death. Her journey led her away from civilization, to mountainous regions where ancient ruins offered shelter. She eventually settled in an abandoned temple. Ironically, another temple dedicated to Athena that had been forgotten when a nearby city was destroyed by wars. It was as if the universe had a particularly cruel sense of humor. Life in isolation was a solitary existence that would make modern hermits seem like social butterflies. Medusa spent her days hunting small animals for food, mainly rodents and birds that didn't require eye contact to catch. She learned to identify edible plants by touch and smell, developed survival skills that would have made her a star on survival reality shows, if not for the small detail of killing cameras and producers just by looking at them. The nights were the worst. Without human company, without books, without entertainment of any kind, she was alone with her memories and the constant sound of the serpents in her hair hissing to each other. It was like having roommates who never stopped talking in a language you didn't understand, and who occasionally bit people. During the first months, Medusa still maintained hope that her condition was temporary. She prayed daily to Athena, asking forgiveness, explaining she had been a victim, begging for her curse to be removed. She lit small oil lamps before a broken statue of the goddess, maintaining rituals she had learned as a priestess. But months turned into years, and Athena remained silent. It was like sending emails to someone who had blocked you. You could keep trying, but you weren't going to get a response. Gradually, Medusa began to accept that her situation was permanent. Solitude was changing her personality in ways she didn't expect. The cheerful and devoted young woman who had left for Athens slowly disappeared, replaced by someone cautious, bitter, and deeply distrustful of any form of hope. It was like watching an optimistic person slowly become cynical after years of disappointments, except the disappointments were literally of mythical proportions. Meanwhile, her fame as the Gorgon spread throughout Greece. Bards sang stories about the terrible monster living in the mountains, transforming brave heroes into stone. The stories became more exaggerated with each retelling. She gained wings in some versions, giant fangs in others, additional magical powers as popular imagination expanded her myth. The irony was that the more famous she became as a monster, the more young and ambitious heroes decided that killing her would be an excellent way to establish their reputations. It was like becoming a video game final boss. The more dangerous your reputation, the more players wanted to try defeating you for experience points. These fame hunters arrived regularly at her refuge. Medusa could hear them approaching, usually announcing their intentions loudly like true Greek tragedy protagonists. "I," hero's name, "have come to prove my worth by killing the terrible Gorgon." It was almost tragicomic. They came looking for a bloodthirsty monster, but found a lonely woman who just wanted to be left alone. Medusa tried to warn them, shouting for them to go away, explaining she didn't want to hurt them. But Greek heroes weren't known for their ability to listen to sensible advice. Invariably, they ignored her warnings and tried to attack her directly. And invariably, they ended up as statues, adding to the involuntary art collection surrounding her abandoned temple. It was like having a sculpture garden, but a garden haunted by all the lives she had accidentally taken. Over time, Medusa stopped trying to save these glory hunters. She developed a routine. When she heard someone approaching, she simply positioned herself where she would be seen immediately, transformed the invader into stone, and then dragged the new statue to join the others. It was efficient, but psychologically devastating. Each new statue represented not just a lost life, but also confirmation that she would never be anything more than the monster Athena had created. It was a cycle of self-fulfilling prophecy. The more people she turned to stone, the more she became the monster everyone believed she was. During decades of isolation, Medusa developed a complicated relationship with her own reflection. She avoided any surface that might show her image, not just from fear of accidentally petrifying herself, but because she couldn't bear to see what she had become. It was like avoiding mirrors after a traumatic change in appearance, but elevated to mythological proportions. The most tragic aspect of her existence was that underneath the curse and isolation, she was still fundamentally the same person who had left for Athens full of dreams and devotion. She still lit lamps before Athena's statue, still whispered occasional prayers, still remembered the lessons she had learned about virtue and wisdom. But these memories only made her current situation more painful. It was like remembering a previous life she could never recover, a former self that had been destroyed not by her own choices, but by the whims of gods who used her as a piece in a game she didn't even know was being played. We now reach the climax of Medusa's story, where we'll discover that even her death was orchestrated by the same gods who had ruined her life. Prepare to meet Perseus, the hero who arrived equipped with cutting-edge divine technology to kill a traumatized woman who just wanted to be left alone. It's basically the story of how a privileged young man, with important family connections and expensive equipment, became famous for executing someone who couldn't even defend herself properly. Let your breathing calm as we explore how Medusa's death was less epic battle between hero and monster, and more god-assisted murder of a trauma victim living as a hermit. It was as if the universe had decided Medusa hadn't suffered enough and needed a glorious ending to complete her personal tragedy. Perseus was, in many ways, the prototype of the privileged Greek hero. Son of Zeus and Princess Danae, he had grown up with all the advantages divine family connections could offer. When he decided he needed a heroic feat to establish his reputation, he naturally chose the target that seemed most impressive on the resume, killing the fearsome Gorgon. It was the ancient equivalent of a rich young man deciding to climb Everest. Technically impressive, but much easier when you have the best equipment and specialized guides. In Perseus's case, his equipment included magical items loaned by the gods themselves, and his specialized guide was Athena, who had personal motives for wanting Medusa dead. The irony here is almost cosmic. Athena, the goddess who had transformed Medusa into a monster to punish her for being raped, was now actively helping someone kill her. It was as if she had decided her initial revenge hadn't been sufficiently complete and needed a grand finale. Or perhaps she simply wanted to eliminate any embarrassing reminder of her own injustice. Perseus received a complete kit of divine tools that made his heroic mission less risky than a modern trip to the supermarket. Hermes lent him winged sandals for flying, a helmet that made him invisible, and a magical bag that could contain Medusa's severed head without risk of accidental petrification. Athena contributed her polished shield, which could be used as a mirror to avoid looking directly at the Gorgon. It was the equivalent of hunting a wounded animal with a military tank, night vision equipment, and an army of support. It technically still requires some courage, but the power difference was so absurd that calling it a fair fight would be laughable. When Perseus finally arrived at the abandoned temple where Medusa lived her solitary exile, he found a scene that should have awakened compassion instead of heroic determination. Dozens of statues surrounded the place, former glory hunters who had met their end trying to kill a woman who just wanted to be left alone. It was like a cemetery of misdirected masculine ambition. Medusa, at this point, had spent decades living in total isolation. She was no longer the radiant young priestess who had left for Athens full of dreams. She was a woman aged prematurely by trauma and loneliness, whose only crime had been being too beautiful in the wrong place at the wrong time. Imagine encountering a war veteran with severe PTSD living as a hermit, and deciding that killing him would be a glorious way to become famous. Perseus approached using the shield as a mirror, flying silently thanks to Hermes' sandals. Medusa, after decades of unwanted visitors, probably heard his approach. She had developed keen senses during years of solitary life. But in her 60s, traumatized and tired of an existence that brought only pain, she perhaps didn't feel much motivation to flee from yet another glory hunter. When Perseus raised his sword, another divine weapon specially forged for the occasion, and prepared for the fatal blow, Medusa probably saw her death coming through the reflection on his shield. Some accounts suggest she didn't try to defend herself, that she simply accepted her fate with the resignation of someone who was tired of living as a monster. The blow was precise and quick. Medusa's head separated from her body and fell to the temple's stone floor, finally silent after decades of hissing serpents. Perseus quickly placed it in the magical bag, carefully avoiding any direct glance that might ruin his victory. But Medusa's death revealed a secret she herself didn't know. From the blood that flowed from her severed neck emerged two extraordinary creatures: Chrysaor, a golden warrior, and Pegasus, the famous winged horse. They were Poseidon's children, conceived during the rape in Athena's temple decades before, who had grown in Medusa's womb without her ever knowing of their existence. It was the final and cruel revelation of how complete and lasting Medusa's trauma had been. She had carried for decades the children of her aggressor, without ever knowing, without ever having the chance to be a mother consciously. It was like discovering that a violence victim had been forced to carry physical reminders of her trauma in a way she didn't even understand. Pegasus, the winged horse, immediately flew to the sky, becoming one of the most celebrated creatures in Greek mythology. Chrysaor disappeared into his own future legends. Both were beautiful, pure, and free, everything their mother had been prevented from being. It was as if Medusa's true essence, the devoted and life-filled young woman she had been before her transformation, could finally escape in the form of her children. Perseus returned triumphant to Athens, carrying Medusa's head as a trophy. He was celebrated as a hero, received honors, was immortalized in stories and sculptures. His victory over the Gorgon established his reputation and opened doors for future adventures. It was the ancient equivalent of becoming famous for a viral video, except the viral content was the murder of a traumatized woman. Athena took Medusa's head and attached it to her shield, where the dead eyes of the former priestess would continue petrifying the goddess's enemies for all eternity. It was the final insult. Even in death, Medusa was forced to continue serving the goddess who had ruined her life. It was like being forced to work for your worst enemy even after dying. The bitterest irony was that Perseus had killed Medusa using exactly the tools and strategies that would have allowed her to live a normal life. If Athena had given Medusa a magical mirror to avoid turning people to stone, if she had offered protection instead of punishment, if she had blamed Poseidon instead of her victim, Medusa could have continued being a devoted priestess. But Greek gods weren't known for their constructive solutions to problems they themselves had created. It was easier to eliminate the problem than admit they had unjustly treated one of their most faithful servants. Medusa's death marked the end of one of the most tragic stories in Greek mythology, the transformation of a devoted young woman into a monster, and then her execution by a hero who became famous for killing her. It was a story about how violence victims can be doubly punished, first by the crime itself, then by how society reacts to the crime. And while Perseus was celebrated for his courage, Medusa was remembered only as the monster he had defeated. The young priestess who had dreamed of serving Athena, who had rejected earthly love for divine devotion, who had been violated and then blamed for her own violation. That person was completely erased from the popular narrative, replaced by the image of a terrible creature that needed to be destroyed. It was the final erasure of a life that had been systematically destroyed by forces beyond her control. Now we reach the most ironic part of Medusa's entire saga. How a story about victim blaming, trauma, and divine injustice was completely reinterpreted over the centuries to become a symbol of female empowerment. Prepare to discover how humanity has an impressive capacity to take the wrong lessons from the most obvious stories, transforming a victim's narrative into a manifesto about dangerous women. Let your mind relax as we explore a fascinating cultural phenomenon. How societies consistently manage to miss the main point of tragic stories, preferring more palatable versions that don't force them to confront uncomfortable truths about violence, power, and injustice. It was as if humanity collectively decided that thinking about real trauma was too depressing, so it was better to focus on the part where the victim becomes powerful, even if that power is literally the ability to accidentally kill people. The first major distortion of Medusa's story happened already in ancient Greece itself, where bards and poets gradually removed the most disturbing details about her origin. Popular versions of the stories began omitting Poseidon's rape, Athena's injustice, and the fact that Medusa had been a devoted priestess. Instead, she was reduced to just one of the three Gorgon sisters, a monster who had always been a monster, born to be defeated by brave heroes. It was the ancient equivalent of Hollywood taking a real story about trauma and transforming it into an action movie where all the inconvenient details are edited out to avoid bothering the audience. Much easier to celebrate Perseus as a hero if you don't mention he basically executed an elderly, traumatized woman living as a hermit. During the Roman period, Medusa was further depoliticized. The Romans, always practical, focused mainly on her aspect as a weapon, the head that could petrify enemies. She appeared on shields, armor, and amulets, reduced to an apotropaic symbol that wards off evil. It was like turning a violence victim's photo into a security company logo, technically related to the original theme, but completely losing the human context. Medieval Christianity gave its own creative interpretation to the story. Medusa became a symbol of dangerous feminine temptation, of beauty that corrupts virtuous men, of the need to resist worldly charms. It was victim-blaming elevated to theological art form, taking a woman who had been unjustly punished for being raped and transforming her into an example of why beautiful women are dangerous to the masculine soul. Medieval writers loved using Medusa as a metaphor for lust, vanity, and other sins associated with femininity. It was as if they had read the original story, completely identified the wrong victim, and decided the moral lesson was, beware of beautiful women, they'll ruin your spiritual life. The Renaissance brought an artistic obsession with Medusa that still influences how we see her today. Painters like Caravaggio created representations of her that were simultaneously terrifying and seductive, focusing on the duality between beauty and death. But these works of art, however technically impressive, continued perpetuating the narrative that Medusa was inherently dangerous, instead of a victim of circumstances. It was like making glamorous portraits of traumatized people, visually impactful, but completely disconnected from the human reality behind the image. The 19th century saw the birth of psychoanalytic interpretations that managed to be even more problematic than previous versions. Freud and his followers transformed Medusa into a symbol of masculine castration anxiety, basically arguing that men feared women because they represented the possibility of losing sexual power. It was victim-blaming with a university degree, transforming a story about a woman who was punished for being raped into a theory about internal masculine fears. Imagine taking someone's trauma story and deciding the main lesson is about how it psychologically affects male observers. It was the kind of interpretation that could only be created by men who never had to personally worry about sexual violence. But it was in the 20th and 21st centuries that Medusa's reinterpretation reached truly impressive levels of irony. The feminist movement discovered her story and decided to transform her into a symbol of female power, strength, and revenge against patriarchy. Medusa became an icon of women who refused to be victims, who transformed their trauma into power, who used their monstrosity as a weapon against oppressors. It was a well-intentioned reinterpretation, but one that still managed to miss the main point of the original story. Medusa hadn't chosen to become powerful. She had been forced to become a monster as punishment for being a victim. Her power was actually a curse that prevented her from having any normal human relationships. It was like celebrating someone for overcoming a trauma that was never actually resolved, just transformed into a different form of suffering. Modern fashion embraced Medusa as an aesthetic symbol, with her image appearing on everything from t-shirts to tattoos to luxury brand logos. Versace made Medusa's head their official symbol, claiming it represents fatal attraction, which is a particularly ironic way to commercialize the image of a sexual violence victim. It was cultural capitalism in its purest form, taking a symbol of trauma and transforming it into a marketable product, completely removing any context that might make consumers uncomfortable. Modern social media is full of posts about Medusa energy, women appropriating her image as representation of not tolerating disrespect, having firm boundaries, transforming pain into power. It was empowerment through identification with a mythological figure, but identification based on a completely sanitized version of the original story. The problem with all these reinterpretations isn't that they're necessarily bad. Many people find genuine strength in identifying with symbols of resistance. The problem is that they consistently ignore the fundamental injustice of Medusa's original story. She wasn't a woman who chose to become powerful. She was a victim who was punished for her own rape and then killed for trying to survive the consequences. Celebrating Medusa as a symbol of empowerment without recognizing she was fundamentally a victim of injustice is like applauding someone for overcoming circumstances that should never have happened in the first place. It's inspiring in a superficial way, but ignores the systemic structures that created the initial problem. The most uncomfortable truth about Medusa's legacy is that it reveals how societies prefer stories about individuals overcoming traumas to confronting the systemic injustices that cause those traumas. It's easier to celebrate a victim who becomes powerful than to question why she was victimized in the first place. If we really wanted to honor Medusa's story, we would focus on the injustice she suffered: Athena's victim blaming, Poseidon's violence, Perseus's celebration for killing her. We would question why a society would create stories where rape victims are punished for their own rapes, where gods are celebrated for behavior we would classify as criminal today. But that would require confronting uncomfortable truths about power, violence, and how societies treat victims. It's much easier to buy a t-shirt with her face and pretend that represents female empowerment. The final irony is that Medusa probably would have been horrified to know she would be remembered as a symbol of dangerous female power. She had spent her life trying to be a devoted priestess, then decades trying to avoid hurting anyone. The last thing she would have wanted was to be transformed into an icon of threatening women. And so we reach the end of the most depressing story in Greek mythology. A journey that began with a young woman full of dreams of serving her goddess and ended with decades of suffering, isolation, and finally death at the hands of a hero who became famous for killing her. As you settle in for a peaceful night's sleep, allow yourself a moment of reflection on how Medusa's story is, unfortunately, timeless in its lessons about power, injustice, and how societies treat their victims. We explored together how a devoted priestess transformed into a monster not through her own choices, but by having the misfortune of being too beautiful in a world controlled by gods with the emotional maturity of spoiled children. We discovered how victim blaming isn't a modern invention. The ancient Greeks had already perfected the art of blaming rape victims for their own rapes, and then punishing those victims in ways that made the original crime seem mild in comparison. We saw how Medusa went from hopeful young woman to traumatized woman, from respected priestess to feared monster, from person with agency over her own life to symbol used by others for their own purposes, first as Athena's weapon, then as Perseus's trophy, and finally as a commercializable icon of misunderstood female empowerment. The most comforting truth about Medusa's story is that it reminds us that surviving injustices is not your personal responsibility. You don't need to transform into something powerful and frightening to deserve compassion. You don't need to overcome traumas in ways that impress observers. You don't need to become an inspirational symbol of anything. You can simply be human, with all the complications and contradictions that implies. Medusa never asked to be transformed into a monster, never chose to live in isolation, never wanted her death to become a symbol of heroic victory. She just wanted to serve her goddess and live a life of purpose and devotion. The fact that this was denied to her wasn't her fault, wasn't karma, wasn't destiny. It was simply pure injustice exercised by beings with enough power to escape the consequences of their actions. As sleep arrives gently, leave behind not just Medusa's tragedy, but also the modern pressure to transform trauma into empowerment, or suffering into strength. Allow yourself the kindness of recognizing that sometimes bad things happen to good people, and that the appropriate response is compassion, not lessons about resilience or inspirational stories about overcoming adversity. In the end, perhaps the greatest honor we can pay to Medusa's memory is to remember her not as monster or symbol, but as a young woman who deserved better, a devoted priestess who was systematically betrayed by every system that should have protected her, and who still maintained her essential humanity even when forced to live as an isolated creature. Good night, and may your dreams be free from the injustices that haunted Medusa, and may you wake in a world that is slowly learning to do better by its victims, even though we still have a long way to go.